This is Biology 101, Chapter 22, Darwinian Evolution. So in this chapter, we're going to begin a discussion of evolution, which Charles Darwin defined as descent with modification in his publications. We can also define evolution as the change in genetic composition of a population over time. So we're looking at what we call allele frequencies, or how often certain alleles show up. So we're going to start to build on our knowledge of genetics and start to look at the genetics of an entire population and how that changes over time. Now, I like to put evolution in the context of something that we're all very familiar with, because when we look at evolution, we're not just looking at change in a particular species, but we're looking at that change as a result of changes in the environment or changes in the other types of organisms living in that environment. There are various things that can actually drive evolution forward. And so if we look at this diagram, it shows us the various types of video game controllers that have ever existed. And the one that I can remember far back to is the Atari controller, which we see up here towards the top. The Atari controller was very simple. It had a simple joystick and a simple red start button. That's partially because the software that particular controller was supporting was simple software. And over time, as we see the software start to develop and become more complex, and we start to see the graphics become more complex and the controls become more complex, now we need to have greater control over what's actually happening. And so we see that over time we see the development of the Nintendo controllers, which now have a few more buttons and a little more control. And then we eventually see the development of the Super Nintendo and Sega controllers. And then eventually you see down here the Nintendo 64 controllers, all the way up to the modern controllers and things that haven't even made it to this chart because it's a little bit older. As the software has developed, we've had to see these controllers evolve in order to be successful in coordinating with and controlling that software. And so that's what we see happening in natural environments, is that as we experience changes in our environments, as we experience new predators or new predator adaptations, or as we start to see climate change having an effect, whatever it is that's changing in that particular environment is going to drive changes within the genetics of a population of a certain species. And we're going to be focusing on how that actually happens in this chapter and the remaining chapters of this unit. So it's good to take a historical view of evolution and kind of look backwards and see how some of these ideas evolved. And we're going to start with Aristotle. So this is way before any ideas about evolution were really prominent in the scientific community. He believed that species were fixed and unchanging. And so it might be a little puzzling to wonder, why in the world is Aristotle, from way back when, a part of our historical view of evolution? But the idea is that even in Aristotle's day, we were looking at species and classifying them. So he developed what he calls the Scala Naturae, or scale of nature, which organizes all living things on a ladder of increasing complexity, and of course humans sit atop this ladder. The idea is that we were organizing them into these groups or classifications. And so in order to be able to do that, we have to be looking at similarities and differences between those organisms, and those are the kinds of ideas that eventually evolved into our modern concepts of evolution. In the 1700s, we see Carl Linnaeus, who developed the two-part naming system that we actually still use today. So for example, Homo sapiens is the scientific name for humans, Homo is the genus name, and sapiens is the species name. You may have in your scientific papers used the Daphnia magna scientific name. Daphnia, again, is the genus name and is more broad, and magna is the particular species name. Linnaeus's ideas about classifying living things was based on what he called patterns of creation. So again, Linnaeus did not believe in evolution. He did not support these ideas, but he was looking at those patterns, those groups, so classifying based on similarities and differences. Sometime later, we see Georges Cuvier, who was very interested in the fossil record. And so when we look at the fossil record, we're looking at living things that have been preserved by the pressure of sediment that's piled up on top of them. And so when we look at the different layers of sediment, anything that's lower in the sediment is going to be older. Anything that's closer to the top in the sediment is going to be something newer. So we can relatively age or date the fossils that we find, but it also kind of gives us a timeline when looking at how species may have changed over time, because you can start to look at those fossils and see maybe similarities and differences between these two, for example. Again, Cuvier did not have any support for the ideas of evolution, but he was looking at the appearance and disappearance of organisms in the fossil record and came up with the idea of catastrophism rather than evolution. So his idea was that, all of these living things have always been here, but we stop seeing some of them show up in the fossil record because there have been major catastrophes that have created changes in the diversity because we've lost certain species because of these big catastrophes, and that's reflected in the fossil record. And then sometime kind of contemporary with Cuvier, we see James Hutton and Charles Lyell, so around that same time. And these two gentlemen were kind of, they had similar ideas, and really I group these two together because they're related. The idea of gradualism, which states that large change occurs due to the accumulation of small changes over time, and uniformitarianism, which says that the mechanisms of change are constant over time. And so the idea is that we have these forces that are promoting change, but those forces are constant. And because those forces are constant, the change that we see is going to be change that occurs very slowly and accumulates and builds up to where we actually see change in the fossil record, and that's gradualism. So these two ideas are very much related, and again, in some cases fit with our modern ideas of evolution, but in many cases do not, because uniformitarianism is not the case. We do not see that those mechanisms of change are constant. We actually see that they're varying and changing. There's a lot of fluctuation. Okay, so let's move up towards some of our more modern ideas of evolution. And we're going to look at Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who proposed an idea for the mechanism of evolution. Now, when we say mechanism of evolution, we're talking about a way that evolution actually happens. Okay, so the first idea for how evolution occurs. So obviously, Lamarck is supportive of the ideas of evolution, but he was the first one to really come out and say, okay, I think evolution happens, and this is how I think it happens. And so he's given a lot of credit for that, even though his ideas for how evolution occurs are not very accurate. So there were two components to Lamarck's ideas about evolution. The first is use and disuse. And so in Lamarck's ideas or beliefs, he said, okay, whenever you're using a part of the body, that part's going to become stronger. And when you're not using a part of the body, then it's going to become weaker, and over time you maybe lose some of the ability to actually function with that part of the body. And so use and disuse means that we develop the parts that we use. Now, that might apply to, going to the gym and working out and building up very large muscles. Okay, so you're using those muscles, maybe your biceps or your quads or whatever it is, you're using those muscles, and so therefore you're developing them, you're gaining strength in those muscles. However, the second part of his idea is where we see the flaws. The second part says that those acquired characteristics, those characteristics that you gain over the course of your lifetime, can be inherited or passed on to your children. And so you going to the gym and working out, building up strong muscles, means that your children are going to have strong muscles. And we know that that's not the case, that your children are going to have to build up those strong muscles and eat the right foods and exercise in order to gain that particular characteristic, because it is acquired over the course of your lifetime. Okay, so Lamarck's ideas are wrong. However, they do provide a framework and a little bit of a foundation on which Charles Darwin's ideas can be built. Because what it comes down to is Lamarck only missed the point by saying these acquired characteristics are passed on. Now, had he said that, these characteristics that are founded in genetics, that are based on genes, can be passed on to offspring, then we're looking at a different scenario. So the classic example that's used to explain Lamarck's ideas are that when we have giraffes, these two giraffes are eating different types of foods. These giraffes on the left are eating the bushes that are kind of lower to the ground, whereas these giraffes on the right are reaching for the leaves on trees that are higher up. And so over time, this giraffe will stretch its neck and stretch its neck, and so it will gain a longer neck and possibly longer legs because it's having to stretch its body to reach these leaves. And so then when it has offspring, it will produce offspring with longer necks, and this giraffe will continue to produce offspring with short necks. And the way that this relates to evolution is, if this particular food source is wiped out, then these giraffes have an advantage. And so we'll tend to see more of these giraffes survive and make offspring. Now, because this trait in Lamarck's philosophy was acquired over the course of that giraffe's life, it's wrong. That's not how evolution occurs. But if we look at evolution from the perspective of this giraffe has genes that allow it to grow a longer neck and longer legs, then yes, we can pass those traits on to our offspring, and those offspring will have an advantage if the only food source around is tall trees. Okay? And that's what Darwin's ideas about natural selection are based on. So let's look at Charles Darwin, early 1800s. He was invited to be a naturalist on the HMS Beagle on a 2-year voyage to chart the South American coastline. So he was going to be the one going out and collecting plants and animals, describing all the different types of things that live on the South American coastline. This voyage actually ended up taking about 5 years, and they ended up taking a little stop in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, which ended up being great because that allowed Darwin to compare all of the different plants and animals that he saw on the islands to the mainland, and that's where a lot of his ideas came from. Now, if we look at the Galapagos Islands, they're a set of volcanic islands off the coast of South America, and what he found was that when he looked at the living things present on the islands, that they were similar to the mainland, but there were modifications in those various species. So each island had different versions of those plants and animals. So for example, each island had its own type of tortoise. And the finches, which is a type of bird, had very different beaks from one island to the next. So if we look at these in picture form, what he found was that on islands where the vegetation was very lush and green and plentiful, the tortoises on those islands tended to have very short necks. But on the islands where vegetation was sparse, the tortoises tended to have longer necks. So the idea is that the longer neck is suited to eating a different food source, something that you have to reach for, maybe something that you have to hunt for a little bit more, something like the taller cacti that we see living in the dry areas. Whereas in an area where there's plenty of vegetation around, you don't need to have that long neck, and so a shorter neck is suited to eating that low-lying vegetation. So the idea that Darwin came up with over time, after he noticed that over and over again the organisms living in an area were well adapted to the climate and the other characteristics of that area, his idea of natural selection was that, okay, in this particular environment where there is very little vegetation, the tortoises that naturally have longer necks because of their genetics are going to be more successful because they can compete for those food sources. And because they're getting plenty of food, they'll survive longer. And because they survive longer, they produce more offspring. So if we look at the ratio of offspring produced by this tortoise and a short-necked tortoise in this environment, these guys are going to make more. And what that means is that with every generation, we accumulate more and more long-necked tortoises and fewer short-necked tortoises. So over time, our population looks almost exclusively like this. In this environment, There's not really a necessary disadvantage to having a long neck like there is here, not something that's in your face anyway. However, if we look at the energy requirements in building that long neck, it does take more energy to do that, and that draws energy away from your reproductive abilities, and so we tend to see that shorter neck tortoises are more successful in terms of reproduction because they're not diverting as many energy resources into building and sustaining that longer neck. Now, the other types of adaptation that he saw in finches, the types of birds, were in their beaks. So on islands where the primary food source was very large seeds, we see beaks that have these really broad and strong beaks, and that allows those birds to be able to crack open and eat the seeds. In environments where the primary food source was cactus fruit, we see kind of a long beak, and it's not nearly as broad, and it definitely doesn't have the strength that it has here. Okay, so this particular beak is going to be suited to eating something that's a little bit softer, whereas in islands where the primary food source is insects, we have to have these kind of long skinny beaks because those beaks are going to allow for the bird to be able to reach into the crevices and the nooks and crannies where you might find an insect and actually grab those and get them to eat. So we see the different beaks allow for those birds to exploit the different resources. And again, this can occur through natural selection because on this island, this beak is going to be more successful, which allows them to survive longer and reproduce more. Whereas on this island, this beak is more successful, and on this island, this beak is more successful. So, Darwin was seeking to explain his observations that all organisms are suited to life in their own particular environments, that there are many shared characteristics among living things. So this goes back to our unity of life philosophy that we talked about early on. We all have the same genetic code, we all have the same protein code, but also within a particular group. So all birds, for example, have some similarities, but we also see great diversity within those groups and among all living things. So Darwin really wanted to kind of explain that. And so he saw these relationships between organisms as a tree. And when we look at modern evolutionary trees, we see that at the tip of the branch of every tree, it is represented a species. So each one of these branches goes to a different species. And where we see two branches meet, we see a common ancestor. So there's a common ancestor located here where this species and this species meet. But there's also a common ancestor here for all three of those species. And there's a common ancestor here for all of these species in this part of the tree. So every time you see branches coming together, you find a common ancestor. And what that means is that at some point in evolution, so we have this common ancestor here, at some point in evolution, we had this species branch to produce this species and this species. And then at some point this species branched to produce this one and this one. And so we see that over time we just keep getting branching of species, which leads to greater and greater diversity. Now, it's estimated that about 99% of all organisms that ever lived are now extinct. And so many branches on our modern evolutionary trees are actually extinct. And very often we're only looking at the 1% of living things that have ever existed. So, Darwin took all of these ideas that he had and kind of mulled them around for a long time and eventually published a work called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in this publication, he was very focused on adaptation because that's the thing that he saw that was most fascinating to him. And so basically, within his idea of natural selection, which is Darwin's mechanism for evolution, or the way that he thinks evolution occurs, there are some basic ideas. The first thing is that there's genetic variation in a population. So there are inherited characteristics, genetic characteristics that vary in a population. So a simple thing is if we were to look at a classroom of students, there are some students with brown hair, blonde hair, red hair, whatever the case may be. Okay, those different phenotypes represent genetic variation for a trait. And what we see is that in all natural populations, there are going to be many, many traits for which there is extensive genetic variation. And the reason that that is important is because that gives evolution something to work on or to build on. The second thing is that all species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. This is important because what it says is that at some point there's going to be this thing called competition. And when you have competition, that means you have winners and losers. And so if you have a genetic characteristic that provides you an advantage in that competition, now you're going to be more likely to survive. So that takes us to our third point. Individuals with inherited traits that enhance their survival and reproduction will be more successful. So these genetic traits allow you to overcome the competition, which means you survive longer and then you reproduce more. So in future generations, those individuals with that particular trait will be more successful than individuals that don't have that trait. And so we'll see higher concentrations or higher numbers of that trait in future generations. So over time, as we accumulate these differences, or as we accumulate these changes in traits that are passed down, we can eventually see the impact that that might have on the species that allows evolution to move forward. Now, Darwin wondered in his publication if the accumulation of these different adaptations could produce a new species. And we now know that yes, that is definitely the case, that we can see the accumulation of adaptations leading to the development of a new species, but we can also see the accumulation of a single mutation leading to the development of a new species. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about in a later chapter, is how those new species can form. Okay, so here's an example of natural selection. In England, before the Industrial Revolution, there were two different versions of peppered moth. We have a light variety, so it has a lighter color with kind of a speckled appearance, and a darker variety, which is pretty much all black. Now, when we look at these two different variations of peppered moth sitting on the bark of a tree or on a rock, you can see that the lighter variation blends in very nicely and the darker variation stands out. And so we would say that the lighter variation trait would be selected for. So what that means is that if nature is selecting a trait that is favorable, then this is the trait that's selected for, because a hawk that's flying over looking for a snack doesn't see this trait, it sees this trait. So the lighter moths are going to be the ones that survive more, so they are selected for. However, after the Industrial Revolution, we see that those same surfaces are now covered with all kinds of soot and pollution. And so now the darker moth tends to blend in nicely, and the lighter moth is the one that stands out. So whereas that moth was selected for before the Industrial Revolution, after the Industrial Revolution, that trait is selected against, and now we see the darker variation is selected for. So the point of this is to show that just because a trait is favorable at one point in time does not mean that it will always be favorable. We do see changes. Okay, a few notes about natural selection. One thing that I want to make sure I emphasize is that individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve. An individual organism does not see changes in its DNA that are going to have an effect on its ability to evolve and adapt to a particular environment. You cannot will yourself the ability to produce gills so that you can survive in water. Okay, individuals don't evolve. Entire populations of a species over time can evolve. Okay. Natural selection only acts on traits that are different. So if everybody has the exact same trait, nobody has an advantage. And so natural selection doesn't act on those particular traits. And then the last point that we made was traits that are favorable in one environment may not be favorable in another. And so it's going to change depending on the environment. So we're going to wrap up this chapter talking about some scientific evidence for evolution, because a lot of people want to say, oh, evolution is just a theory, there's nothing to it, there's no science behind it, and there actually is a great deal of science. And we're only going to be hitting on the surface of a few key points. So we're going to talk about direct observations of evolutionary change, homology, the fossil record, and biogeography, and how those things all support what we know about evolution. So, direct observation. Typically, we think about this as something that we can actually sit and watch. And we have to kind of be a little bit more lenient with that definition, because evolution, because it takes so long, is not something that you can sit and watch. However, over time, we can monitor how populations change, and that allows us to directly observe over long periods of time this genetic change that occurs. So one example of that is soapberry bugs. These are bugs that feed on the seeds of soapberry plant. And the way that they do that is they insert their beak, which is a very long extension on the front of the insect, into the plant, into the seed, and they get the nectar from inside. Okay, so they have to go all the way through the fleshy part of the plant to get to the good stuff on the inside. Now, what we see is that over time, these plants have evolved different variations. And so some variations of the plants have a very thin flesh, and some variations have a very thick flesh. And so what we have found by studying these different populations is that in the areas where the plants grown have a thin flesh, we find insects that have a very short beak. But in the areas where the plants have a thicker flesh, the insects have a longer beak. And that's because in order to be able to feed on this food source, they have to have a longer beak to get to the good stuff on the inside of the fruit. And so the insects that have a short beak in those environments are not going to survive and reproduce. So they won't be successful living there. And so that's one thing that we have observed by following these populations over time. But another example is something that you may be familiar with called MRSA. This stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a type of bacteria. Methicillin is a type of antibiotic that normally kills bacteria. So MRSA is a type of bacteria that is resistant to the thing that normally kills bacteria. So you can imagine that it's a problem. This is one of those things that if we find it in hospitals, we kind of try to quarantine and make sure that there's no ability of passing that on to other patients, because these infections are very, very difficult to fight. Okay, and so we know that MRSA has not always been around. Okay, so where did it come from? And the idea, or the answer, is that it has evolved from a different strain of Staphylococcus aureus that is not resistant. So we've seen mutations that have been introduced that allow these MRSA strains to now be able to grow in the presence of the thing that is supposed to kill them. Okay, that is a direct observation because we've been able to document over time the increase in prevalence or the discovery of MRSA itself. Okay, our second type of evidence for evolution is called homology. And remember, we've said that that prefix homo means same. And so this is going to be things that are same between different species, or at least similar. So there are three different types of homology that we're going to address. We're going to look at structural or anatomical homology. Anatomical refers to anatomy, which is the different structures. We're going to look at developmental homology, so stages of development, and then molecular homology, which refers to molecules like DNA and protein. Now, homology suggests something called divergent evolution, which means that there was a common ancestor that diverged or branched off into two different species. And the reason that it suggests that is because when we look at species that we think have a common ancestor, we see some similarities or homology between their structures. So, for example, in the forelimbs of humans, cats, whales, and bats, these four pictured here, we see that all of these organisms have the same number of bones and the same types of bones in their forelimbs. Okay, so we've got one here, two here, so your humerus, your radius, and your ulna. Okay, we see the same arrangement in all of these other organisms, but the thing that's different is the shape and the size of those bones. So definitely whales have a very different arrangement than cats and humans. Okay, and then when we look, for example, at the rest of the bones, we've got these carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. That's the remainder of the bones here. You can see that again, in humans, that structure is going to be a little bit different than looking at bats, for example, where the phalanges are extended significantly. But they all have the same number and types of bones, which suggests that there was an ancestor way back here, and over time we've seen evolution occur that has allowed this structure to evolve in humans, so we can use our arms for carrying things, for manipulating our environment. A similar but slightly different structure in cats, especially when we look at the wrist and the hands or paws. So their forelimbs are used primarily for bearing weight when they walk around. Whale fins are primarily used for swimming, and bat wings are primarily used for flying. Okay, very different arrangements or structures of the bones themselves, but the arrangements, the way they're put together, is the same. Okay. It is very unlikely that all of these organisms would have developed that exact same arrangement of bones completely independent of each other. It's much more likely that there was a common ancestor that had that arrangement, and over time, as these species evolved, they just kind of took that arrangement and did something a little bit different with it. Okay, we also see developmental homology, where many organisms have similar stages of development. So again, we're looking at things that are the same. So if we look at all vertebrate embryos, at some point in development, all vertebrate embryos have a tail, but over the course of that development, we lose that tail in many species. We also see pharyngeal pouches present in all vertebrate embryos, but those pharyngeal pouches go on to become different things. So in humans, they develop into the ears and the throat, but in fish, they develop into gills. And so the stage looks very similar, very, very early on in development, but then as that organism grows and differentiates, it becomes different. Okay, vestigial structures. These are going to be things that are vestiges of a former structure, former body plan, things that are no longer of use or no longer have a purpose, but there are remnants of that structure that remain. So in humans, the coccyx, which is the tailbone, is thought to be a remnant of a tail. In snakes, there are remnants of femurs, which are leg bones. We know snakes don't have legs, okay? So the fact that they have a pelvic girdle and they have these very, very undeveloped leg bones suggests that at some point way back when, one of their ancestors did. And then finally, molecular homology is going to be when we are seeing similar genes, similar proteins in related organisms. And again, that suggests a common ancestor, and over time, the different species have developed slightly different variations of those genes or proteins. And so this chart just shows you proteins in a particular group of plant species where the blue parts are identical among all of them. The yellow parts are going to be things that are maybe a little bit different from one species to the next. The genes may have the same function in those different species, or they may have different functions between the species, but the idea is that the gene itself remains intact and has a very, very similar or conserved sequence. Now, we said that when we look at homology, that it indicates or suggests something called divergent evolution. And so, again, looking at this tree, here's a common ancestor. In divergent evolution, we see that that common ancestor branches off and produces species A and also this common ancestor, which then eventually branches off and produces species B, and this common ancestor, which eventually branches off and produces C and D. Okay, so those are all divergent events where we see a common ancestor branch off. But because we have a certain body plan in this common ancestor, it is likely that A, B, C, and D are all going to have some similarities to that body plan and therefore similarities to each other. But we can also have something called convergent evolution occurs, where we have similar traits that evolve along completely different pathways. And so they converge on a particular trait and produce something called analogous structures rather than homologous structures. So for example, if we were to look at the wings of a bird compared to the wings of a bumblebee, they're going to be very, very different structures. Okay, they're put together different ways. However, they have a similar function. So that trait of being able to fly evolved through very different paths, but converged on the same function. Okay. The structures themselves are different and would be called analogous. So those are two different ways that we can look at evolution, and you would use those depending on the example that you're looking at. Our third type of evidence for evolution is the fossil record. And so we said, that fossils are produced by, sediment that piles up and applies pressure to a dead organism and is able to preserve certain structural features of that organism. So when we look at fossils and we kind of look at them relative to where they are in the fossil record, it kind of helps us to document that pattern of evolution, because we can see how things have changed over time. And it also allows us to see where new species were introduced and kind of estimate where other species became extinct. So the fossil record is a very powerful tool, even though it does not allow us to document everything, because not everything got fossilized. It does allow us to kind of at least create some framework of how evolution has occurred, so that we can make estimations or predict models about what happened in the gaps in between. And then our last type of evidence for evolution is something called biogeography. Geography refers to location, and bio refers to living things. So we're looking at the location of living things, or the distribution of species on this planet. And there are some species that only live in one part of the world. Okay, there are other species that have wider ranges. They live in different parts of the world. But the reason that this is important is because we know that those species that live only in one part of the world live there because they are adapted to that particular environment. But we can also start to pair biogeography with things like the fossil record, because we may be able to find fossils that are similar to that particular species in different parts of the world. And it makes sense if we look at the way that our land masses have changed over time. So we know that at some point in time, all of our land masses were connected as this very large land mass called Pangaea, and over time we've seen those land masses separate into the continents that we know today. And so if we know that one part of the world was connected to a different landmass, much earlier in our history, then we can start to look to see what kinds of fossils are in that area that show similarities about how things have evolved over time. It also helps to explain some interesting things in the fossil record when we find similar fossils in two very unrelated places. If we look back at how those land masses have changed and moved over time, we can start to explain those kinds of things. Okay, that's it for chapter 22. We'll be moving on to look at the evolution of populations in chapter 23.